Christian king, burning in the fire of faith. A Muslim empire quiet, but ready with steely resolve. When the Crusader flags waved on the banks of the Nile, so the land of Egypt did not remain silent. This was no ordinary war. This was the moment when fate held the sword, where faith, strength, pride, and wisdom come face to face. A king was imprisoned, and a nation rose up. Here is the story, the seventh collision of the cross and the crescent, where the end was more dangerous than the beginning. Summary: the 7th Crusade lasted from 1248 to 1254 and was led by King Louis IX of France. The war was primarily fought to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims, but the battleground was Egypt. Crusader forces captured Damietta, but soon faced strong resistance from Muslim leaders such as Sultan al-Salih Ayyub and later Baybars and Cats. The Crusaders were badly defeated at the Battle of Mansoura, and King Louis himself was captured. He was released after a heavy ransom, but the crusade was a complete failure. This war was not only a military but also a proof of the declining power of the Crusaders in political and religious terms. After his release, Louis stayed in the Holy Land for 4 years, looking to the Pope and Europe for help. But there were very few who responded to his calls for help. Yes, but there was an effective response. They were the shepherds of France who joined the war. For this reason, it is also called the Shepherds' Crusade. These crusaders fought to save the French king, but destruction was their destiny. Then, in 1254, Louis returned to France after some important treaties. Louis's Tunisian Crusade of 1270 was also a failure, as was the 7th Crusade, the 8th Crusade, where he died of dysentery shortly after the end of the campaign. Background: in the years following the 6th Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen to the Crusaders, and both the Ayyubid dynasties were embroiled in internal strife that ultimately proved disastrous for both. The defeat of Jerusalem in 1244 and the defeat of Gaza ultimately led to the destruction of Christian military power in the Holy Land and the rise of the Mamluk Empire. Against this background, Louis Nam of France and Pope Innocent IV launched the 7th Crusade to recover Jerusalem. Jerusalem from 1241 to 1244. The Barons' Crusade ended in 1241 with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the largest kingdom since 1187. When Richard of Carnival completed his negotiations with the Muslims, he secured the support of the influential family of John of Abilene, the Old Lord of Beirut. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was crowned king in March 1229, and the Ebelins agreed to accept him as co-ruler. The kingdom was also stable at Acre until Richard's return home on May 3, 1241, but after Frederick's rejection as king, there was no central authority. Meanwhile, Richard Flangery remained in Tyre, while various barons returned to their fiefs in Syria and Cypress, and Philip of Montfort, Lord of Tyre, remained in Acre. Dissatisfied with the treaty with Egypt, the Templars besieged the Hospitallers in Acre and Hebron in 1241, who, under Grand Master Pierre de Vielbrud, supported the treaty. The siege was responded to by al-Nasir Dawood, a Hospitallers' ally, by attacking Christian pilgrims and In retaliation, the Templars captured Nablus on October 30th, 1242, burning the mosque and killing the local Christians. Some of the Hospitallers joined Flangery in plotting to hand over Acre to the Imperialists. The Templars, Philip of Montfort, the Genoese, and the Venetians put down the attempted coup. The main body of the Hospitallers who had carried out military operations against Aleppo at El-Merkab returned, and de Wildbride foiled the plot. The city remained under the control of Abilene, while Flangery was recalled to Italy. On June 5, 1243, the Haute-Cour ruled that Alice and her now-husband Ralph of Nesle had the right to rule Jerusalem as Conrad II's regents, until he became king. Tyre was occupied by Richard's brother, Lothair Flangery. When Richard, driven by a storm, took refuge in a port, he was captured by the barons, who were later ransomed by Lothair on July 10, 1243, by ransoming the castle at Tyre. Balin of Ebeln was appointed royal guardian of Tyre, and the kingdom was eventually handed over to Philip of Montfort. Jerusalem was essentially a feudal republic, governed by the most powerful barons. After the recovery of Jerusalem and much of the Galilee, the empire was unable to reorganize sufficiently to meet the threats from the Aubaids and the Mongols. The conflicts between Frederick II's imperial followers and the Abelians, between the Templars and the Hospitallers, and the Acre versus Tyre left the empire almost defenseless. The defeat of the Imperials gave the Templars a strong position. In 1243, with the alliance of the rulers of Homs, Carrick, and Damascus, a treaty was negotiated against Egypt, which eased tensions between the Crusaders and restored the Temple Mount to order. Grand Master Armand de Perigord triumphantly reported the Templars returned to their original home to the Pope. The condition of the Ayyubids since Sultan Al-Kamal's death in 1238. The political situation in Egypt and the Levant has been chaotic, with rivalry between his sons arising. In early 1240, while preparing to invade Egypt, the eldest son Salih Ayyub received word that his half-brother Al-Adil II, then the Sultan, was being held captive by his soldiers. Salih Ayyub was immediately invited to come to Egypt and take over the kingdom. In June 1240, he entered Cairo in triumph and assumed the rule of the Ayyubid dynasty. Although enthroned in Cairo, Salih was not safe, as his family and allied Kurdish clans divided loyalties. Within Egypt, a powerful faction of emirs was plotting to depose him and replace him with his uncle Salih Ismail, who had regained control of Damascus. Al-Salih took refuge in the citadel of Cairo, no longer trusting even his loyal emirs who had given him power. Capetian mercenaries, who had defeated the Mongols in Central Asia and now held high ranks in the Egyptian army, soon became the center of power in Egypt, known as the Mamluks. During the 7th Crusade, these Mamluks finally overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty and consolidated their power over Egypt. In the early 1240s, a Central Asian tribe known as the Khwarezmians invaded the territories of Aleppo and conquered the Levant within 4 years. Before capturing Manbij, he defeated the Halabi army of Almazam Turan Shahsan of Saladin near Baiza on November 11, 1240. Emir al-Mansur Ibrahim of Homs, who had assumed power anew after the death of his father al-Mujahid, finally defeated the Khwarezmid on January 6, 1241, near Edessa, along with the emir of Damascus, Badr al-Din Lulu. After this, the army of Aleppo, together with a Seljuk army under the leadership of Khusro II, defeated an Ayyubid army led by Al-Saliha's son and viceroy Turan Shah. The Khwarizms then allied with Al-Muzaffar Ghazi to launch a counterattack, and were defeated at Al-Majdal in August 1242. Then Khusro II suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Mongols at the Battle of Kostag in June 1243, threatening all of Mesopotamia. Battle of La Forbe. At the invitation of Al-Salih, the Khwarizm army advanced into Syria and Palestine and destroyed the Holy City in the Siege of Jerusalem on July 15, 1244. The city's fortress, the Tower of David, surrendered on August 23, 1244, and the city's Christian population was expelled. At the end of the same year, Salih again allied with the Khwarezmids against the Crusaders. Salih Ismail and the Crusaders faced off at the Battle of La Forbe, in Gaza, the last Christian power in the Holy Land. In 1245, Salih captured Damascus, and the Caliph of Baghdad bestowed upon him the title of Sultan. In 1246, he judged that his Khwarezmian allies were dangerously out of control, so he attacked and defeated them near Homs, killing their leaders and scattering the remnants throughout Syria and Palestine. Three years later, when the Crusades began, Salih was fighting his uncle in Syria, and he quickly returned to Egypt, where he died on November 22, 1249. The 1243 treaty with the Ayyubids did not maintain peace for long, but the military authorities of the empire united to fight at Hirabia from 17 to October 18, 1244, sometimes called the Battle of La Forbe or the Battle of Gaza. The armies of the Khwarezmis. In what was to be the last major battle between the Franks and the Muslims, 5,000 Crusaders were killed and 800 taken prisoner. Among the dead were Grand Master of the Templars Armand de Perigord and Paterdom of Sergeants, Archbishop of Tyre, while among the prisoners were the commanders Walter Four and Brian. Only 33 Templars, 27 Hospitallers, and 3 Teutonic Knights survived, fleeing to Escalon with Philip of Montfort and the Latin Patriarch Robert of Nantes. Louis Gnome of France. In 1214, a son was born to Louis VIII of France, who was named Louis IX. His father died on November 25, 1226. Just 3 years after taking the throne, Louis was 12 years old at that time. He was crowned king within a month, and his mother ruled France as regent, training him to be a great leader and a good Christian. Innocent IV and Louis IX. In late 1244, Louis suffered a severe malaria infection. Near death, he vowed that if he recovered, he would set out on a crusade. His life was spared, and as soon as his health permitted, he took up the cross and immediately began preparations for war. Innocent IV became pope on June 25, 1243, facing religious and political crusades. At the time, the papacy was in conflict with Emperor Frederick II, who had been excluded from the Crusades by the previous pope. Frederick was at first pleased with his choice, but it soon became clear that Innocent intended to continue the traditions of his predecessors. Fearing that he would be kidnapped, Innocent IV left Rome in March 1244, pursued by the emperor's cavalry. The Pope asked Louis Nam for political asylum, which was cautiously refused. In exile, the Pope presided over the First Council of Lyon in 1245. The council directed a new crusade under the command of Louis Nom, with the aim of reconquering the Holy Land, and the Pope formally deposed Emperor Frederick from the imperial throne and from the throne of Naples. From Gregory IX, Innocent IV inherited the Prussian crusade targeting Orthodox Russians. Innocent was also the first to seriously face the challenge posed by the Mongol invasion of Europe during 1241. After Lyons, Innocent sent envoys to the Mongols, who also negotiated with the Russian princes on the Church's union with Rome. Daniel Romanovich of Galicia-Volhynia and Yaroslav II, Grand Prince of Vladimir, both responded positively, so the Pope abandoned the idea of an alliance with the Mongols and instead intended to form a grand alliance with the Russians to counter the Mongol threat. In January 1248, Innocent, together with the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order Heinrich von, warned Alexander Nevsky, son of Daniel and Yaroslav, of Mongol attacks on Christendom and asked them to unite in defense against the invaders. Both Russian princes accepted this proposal. Eventually, all Eastern European rulers, not yet under Mongol rule, now joined the alliance of the Innocents. In September 1243, he issued a bull authorizing the Northern Crusades. Innocent IV was determined in his goal to destroy Frederick II. Louis Nam's efforts to bring about peace were to no avail. In 1249, the Pope ordered a crusade against Frederick II, and after the emperor's death in December 1250, he continued to fight with unceasing vigor against Conrad IV of Germany and his half-brother Manfred of Sicily. After the deposition of Frederick II, the crown of Sicily was transferred to the Holy See, and Innocent I presented it to Richard of Cornwall and Edmund Crouchbeck, brother and son of Henry III of England. After the death of Conrad IV in May 1254, the Pope finally recognized the hereditary claims of Conrad's 2-year-old son Conradin. Manfred also submitted, but soon rebelled and defeated the papal forces at the Battle of Foggia on December 2, 1254. A few days later, Innocent IV died. Negotiations with the Mongols. In 1245, Innocent IV began efforts at Franco-Mongol unity by sending 2 embassies to the Holy Land and the Baltics to the court of the Great Khan of Mongolia. An embassy traveled from Russia and Central Asia to Karakorum. Yuk Khan, after receiving a request from the Pope to accept Christianity, demanded that the Pope recognize his suzerainty and pay tribute to him. Thus, the Mongols refused. The second embassy went to Tabriz in May 1247 to meet the Mongol general Biju Nuyen. Biju Nuyen saw fit to engage the Syrians and Franks in a mutual crusade and planned to attack Baghdad himself. He sent his envoy to Rome, which raised the hopes of the West again. In November 1248, Biju returned without further action on the proposed alliance. Preparations for the crusade in 1247, Louis Mayhem of France took up the cross after recovering from a fatal illness. Within 2 months, a papal bull was issued, authorizing crusade preaching. Cardinal Bishop Odo of Frascati began preaching in France. As a cardinal, he led the propaganda campaign for Louis's first crusade with his head and king in the east as papal vicar. This propaganda continued vigorously from 1245 to 1248. Recruitment in France was slow. Louis's youngest brother, Alphonse of Poitiers, took the cross in 1245. Other brothers, Charles I and Robert I of Artois, also joined. In 1248, Louis failed to convince Haakon IV of Norway to join him as commander of the crusading fleet. Theobald of Champagne also refused to join, but provided 1,000 men. Participation of the British. Henry III of England, after being defeated by Louis Nam at Tilburg in 1242, did not want to join the French war, so he refused. Henry signed an armistice promising not to invade French territory during the Crusade. And a small English army, led by William Longspy, sided with the Crusaders. While the English historian Matthew Paris wrote that he did not travel to the Holy Land. Financing the Crusades. Louis's expenses on the Crusades exceeded 1.5 million livres tournois, 6 times his annual income. So in 1248, he expelled the Jewish moneylenders from his kingdom, confiscating their property, which represented the king's anti-Jewish policies and prejudices. Thus, the expenses of this war were funded from Jews. Some money was obtained from vows and religious donations. The acquisition of knowledge was taxed at 20%, while the French clergy offered a tenth in 5 years. Departure. In late August 1248, a 10,000-strong force left with Louis. His entourage included his wife, Queen Margaret of France, the king's 2 brothers, Beatrice of Provence, Margaret's sister, and Robert I of Artois. The king's magisterial council included his cousins and vassals, Hugh IV of Burgundy and Peter Malceric, who were considered veterans due to the barons' participation in the Crusades. The English contingent was led by William Longspy, England's grandson. The beginning of the Crusade break in Cyprus. Louis IX arrived in Cyprus on September 17, 1248, and waited for the rest of his forces. This delay proved costly, as many died of disease, including John of Montfort, Peter of Vendôme, John I of Drax, and Archambault of Bourbon. When the armies gathered in Cyprus for the Crusade, Henry I of Cyprus welcomed them. John of Abelin, nephew of the old lord of Beirut, later joined in 1249. It was the richest and weakest province of the Aubaids, and many remembered how the Sultan's father, Al-Kamal, himself had been persuaded to give up Jerusalem in exchange for Damietta in the 5th Crusade. Louis wanted to start the operation at once but was prevented by the Grand Masters and the Syrian barons, because the winter storms were about to start soon, and it was a very dangerous journey to reach the shores of the Nile Delta. In addition, they hoped to persuade the king to interfere in the affairs of the Aubaids. Louis wanted them to fight instead of plotting or diplomacy, because he had come to fight the Muslims. He ordered the negotiations to end and sent a list of demands to the Sultan. Sultan's reply was equally diplomatic. Louis now followed the Pope and began diplomacy with the Mongols. In December 1248, 2 Nestorians named Mark and David arrived in Nicosia. He was sent to Mosul by the Mongol general El-Jajadi Nuyan, Azim Khan's commissioner, with a letter expressing Mongol sympathy for Christianity. From the camp at El-Jajadi, de Longuem set out for Mongolia. On reaching the Karakoram, he found that Gyuk, with whom the Pope had communicated, was dead. His widow Oghul Kamish, now regent. He accepted the king's gifts and refused to send a large expedition to the west. And this diplomacy also failed. The Crusaders at Damietta. Sultan al-Salih Ayyub spent the winter in Damascus, trying to complete the conquest of Homs before the Franks attacked. He expected that the Crusaders would attack Syria, so he concentrated all his forces in Damascus. Suffering from tuberculosis, he depended on his elderly vizier, Fakhr al-Din ibn al-Sheikh, who had negotiated with Frederick II to command the army during the 6th Crusade. He sent stores of munitions to Damietta and placed it under the protection of the Bedouin tribesmen of Banu Kinana, who were famous for their bravery. On May 13, 1249, a fleet of 120 large transport ships assembled and the army began its journey. A few days later, a storm scattered the ships and the king finally set sail on May 30th, arriving in Dimitri on June 4, 1249. Only 1/4 of his force left with him, the rest making their way independently to the coast of Egypt. On the morning of June 5th, the siege of Damietta began. A great battle took place on the seashore under the leadership of the king. Muslims were defeated. During the night, Fakhr al-Din retreated across a bridge of boats to Damietta, and, seeing the state of the city, made his escape. His orders to destroy the bridge of boats were not carried out, giving the Crusaders access to the city. And finally Damietta, unscathed, fell into Crusader possession. A victory at Damietta so soon was unexpected. But Louis, knowing his experience at the First Battle of Mansoura in 1221 during the 5th Crusade, did not advance before the river had flooded. He was also waiting for help from his brother Alphonse. In the meantime, Damietta once again turned into a Frankish city. The Amr ibn Laas mosque was converted into a cathedral, where Louis's son was later baptized. Thus Damietta briefly became Outremer's capital during the summer months. The humid heat of the Nile Delta led to disease and food shortages in the camp. The loss of Damietta once again shocked the Muslim world, and like his father 30 years earlier, Salah Ayyub offered Damietta in exchange for Jerusalem. The offer was rejected because Louis refused to communicate with an infidel. Meanwhile, those responsible for the loss of the city were punished. The emirs of Kinana were executed and Fakhr al-Din and his Mamluk commanders were reprimanded. Rumors of a mutiny began to spread, but Fakhr al-Din stopped them and remained loyal to the family. The troops were now marched to Mansoura, built by Al-Kamal on the site of his 1221 victory over the Crusaders. The Bedouins carried out guerrilla operations around the walls of Damietta, making the Franks afraid to venture out, while the Franks built dikes and dug ditches to protect the city. The Nile Delta. In late October 1249, the Nile receded, and Alphonse arrived with reinforcements from France. Now was the time to advance on Cairo. But the target was suddenly changed and Alexandria was attacked instead of Cairo, which surprised the Egyptians, and the Crusaders gained control of Egypt's Mediterranean coast. But Louis's second brother, Robert I, accompanied the king on November 20th, 1249, marching from Damietta to Mansoura. Al-Salih Ayyub died on November 23, 1249, after having his leg amputated in an attempt to save his life from a serious abscess. At that time, Al-Salih's son Al-Muazzam Turan Shah was deployed with an army at some distance from Egypt. Al-Salih's widow, Shajar al-Durna, concealing the news of her husband's death, drew up a document under her signature appointing Turan Shah as heir and Fakhruddin as viceroy. When Saleh's death was finally revealed, Tafrank's spirits rose even higher. The route taken by the Crusaders from Damietta passed through several canals and branches of the Nile. Fakhr al-Din kept the bulk of his army behind Bahr al-Sagar and sent his cavalry to harass the Franks as they crossed the canals. On December 7, 1249, a battle took place near Farsore, where the Egyptian cavalry was defeated and the Templars, against orders, pursued the retreaters. On December 14th, Louis reached the village of Baraman, just 10 miles north of his objective, and for the following week camped on the riverbank in front of Mansoura. Meanwhile, on December 29th, Bishop Hugh of Clermont died. Battle of Mansoura. For 6 weeks, the armies of Maghreb and Egypt faced off on opposite sides of the canal, leading to the Second Battle of Mansoura, which would end with the Ayyubid victory on February 11, 1250. An attempt by the Egyptians to attack the Franks from the rear was thwarted by Charles I of Anjou. Louis ordered the construction of a bridge to cross the aqueduct, but enemy bombardment, including the use of Greek fire, caused this work to be abandoned. At this point, an Egyptian came to the Coptic camp and offered to reveal the location of a fort across the canal. Thus, on the morning of February 8th, the Crusaders took Parker over the canal. The king led the advancing army while Hugh IV of Burgundy and Renaud de Vichiers remained behind to guard the camp. The vanguard was led by Robert I and supported by Templars and English troops. He was ordered not to attack unless instructed by the king. But as soon as Robert crossed the river, despite opposition, he attacked the Egyptian camp. The Egyptians were unprepared. Franks' cavalry began slaughtering the Muslims, and those who survived fled towards Mansoura. Fakhr al-Din, coming out of the Jawabi bath, heard the sound of the attack, mounted his horse and charged into battle, but was cut down by the Templar knights. After capturing the Egyptian camp, Robert was now again warned by some of the commanders to wait for the main army to arrive, but he refused. Although Fakhr al-Din was dead, his commanders, Qutuz and Rukn al-Din Baybars, both later Mamluk sultans, took over the Egyptians. They ambushed the troops in the city, allowed the Frankish cavalry to enter through an open gate, and the Egyptians ambushed them. Horses could neither turn nor fight well in the narrow spaces of the city. A few knights who ran towards the river on foot drowned in its waters. Only 5 of the 290 Templars survived. Among the survivors were the Templar Master Duke of Brittany and Peter Molcerk. Among the dead were the king's brother Robert I, William Longspy and most of his English followers, Peter of Courtenay, and Raoul II of Coucy. The survivors went to the king and told the news. Hearing this news, Louis drew up his front line to meet an attack. And sent engineers to build a bridge over the river. To protect it, they shot arrows from their bows. Now the Mamluks also came out of the city and marched towards the enemy, to prevent them from crossing the river. After some skirmishes, the bridge was finally built and the Crusaders crossed the river, seeing which the Egyptians retreated back into the city. Mayhem in Farsore. On February 11, 1250, the Egyptians attacked again, with reinforcements from the south reinforcing the Franks. On the left flanked the Syrian and Cypriot barons, while on the right the remnants of the Templars and French nobles wavered, whom the king went and took over. The Templar masters and acting Hospitaller Jean de Rouen were also killed in this battle. As night fell, the Muslims abandoned the attack and returned to the city. For 8 weeks, Louis awaited the conquest of Cairo in the Crusader camp. On February 28, 1250, Turan Shah arrived in Cairo from Damascus, where he had been proclaimed sultan after his father's death. His arrival was the trigger for a new invasion of Egypt. A fleet of light boats was constructed and transported by camel to the lower reaches of the Nile. There they began plundering and destroying the ships that brought food from Damietta, capturing more than 80 Frankish ships. On March 16, 1250, a 32-member convoy was killed. The Franks were now plagued by famine and disease, with diseases such as dysentery and typhoid rampant. Prisoner of Farsore on April 6, 1250, the Battle of Farsore was a decisive defeat for Louis's army. Louis knew that the army must be withdrawn from Damietta and began negotiations with Turan Shah, offering to exchange Damietta for Jerusalem. The Egyptians, seeing the tide now turning against the Crusaders, turned down the offer. For a hasty retreat, these officers urged Louis to move immediately to Damietta, but he refused to leave his men. It was decided that the sick should be sent up the Nile by boat, and the rest should follow the same route by which they had come. They set out on the morning of April 5th, and the painful journey began, the king leading the way and the Egyptians in pursuit. The Franks succeeded in crossing the Albar el-Sagite, but failed to destroy the bridge behind them. The Egyptians crossed it and began to attack the Franks from all sides. Their attacks were repulsed and the Franks slowly advanced. That night Louis fell ill. The next day, the Muslims surrounded the army at the town of Farsore, 10 miles southwest of Damietta, and attacked with full force. Among the dead was Hugh XI of Lusignan. The sick and tired soldiers knew that their end had come. Geoffrey of Surgeons, commander of the royal bodyguard, sheltered the king in nearby Sharmasa. On April 6th, Philip of Montfort negotiated directly with the Sultan upon Louis's surrender. The king and his companions were taken in chains to Mansoura, and his entire army was surrounded and imprisoned. The ships transporting the sick to Damietta were also surrounded and captured. Egypt's dream of victory remained unfulfilled. An anguished Templar cried thus: "Anger and sadness are sitting so firmly in my heart that I don't dare to live. It seems that God wants to support the Turks in our loss. Ah God, alas, the realm of the East is so lost that it will never rise again. They will build a mosque of the convent of Holy Mary, which should be wept over, so we are also forced. Anyone who wants to fight the Turks is crazy, because Jesus Christ will not fight them anymore. They have conquered, they will conquer. Every day they drive us before them, knowing that God, who was awake, is now asleep, and Muhammad has become powerful." Imprisonment and release of Louis. The Egyptians were surprised by the large number of Crusader prisoners, estimated by the Sultan himself at 30,000. Louis was moved to a private residence in Mansoura, and the Crusader leaders were held together in a large prison. Very strict conditions were placed on Louis. He had to pay a ransom of 1 million bezants, later reduced to 800,000, by the surrender of Damietta and his army. After the terms were agreed, the king and barons were taken to Farsore, where the Sultan took up residence. From there, they would take Damietta, and on April 30th, 1250, the city of Damietta was to be handed over. When Robert arrived there, he found Turan Shah dead, having been killed on May 2nd, 1250 in a rebellion led by Baybars, instigated by his stepmother Shajar Elder. Aibak became the commander after the assassination of Turan Shah, who later married his widow. The agreement made by Turan Shah was now considered worthless. Some of the Mamluks drew their swords on the king and the captive barons. But, in the end, the Egyptians confirmed the agreed terms. On May 6th, Geoffrey of Sargans surrendered Damietta to the Muslim army, leaving his brother Alphonse as a hostage with the Egyptians. Louis and the Baron set out for Acre, where they arrived on May 12, 1250 after a stormy journey. After the Egyptian campaign, the 7th Crusade lasted another 4 years, but no more battles were fought. When news of the disaster reached Europe, riots broke out in Venice and other Italian cities. France plunged into a kind of public mourning. In France, the reaction took a more aggressive turn. Meanwhile, Turan Shah's death essentially ended the Ayyubid Empire started by Saladin. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad did not accept Shajar el-Dur. Shajar, who had married her commander Aibak, abdicated and handed over the throne to her husband. Aibak's official rule ended after only 5 days. The naval Mamluks, who had primary control over Egypt, enthroned the 6-year-old Al-Ashraf Musa as sultan. Nevertheless, the real power in Egypt still rested with Aibak, who returned to his old position. Egypt remained a Mamluk empire until 1517. Louis's brothers refused to send help from France, where public opinion was angry and desperate. The French nobles had turned against the Pope who had declared the Crusades. On December 13, 1250, Frederick II, revered in Muslim circles, died in Italy. Shepherd's Crusade. The Shepherd's Crusade of 1251 was a popular crusade by poor shepherds and peasants from northern France to help the captive Louis and defend the Holy Land from the infidels. After his release from the Egyptians, Louis sent his brothers to France to seek aid, and his mother Blanche of Castile, acting as regent, tried unsuccessfully to find reinforcements, as neither nobles nor clergy helped. On this occasion, the citizens rose up and announced that they would go to the rescue of the king. Eastertime, known as the Master of Hungary, was a mysterious man. It is said that in 1251, he began preaching a crusade to shepherds in the north of France, always carrying a map given to him by the Virgin Mary. He attracted a large crowd and allowed them to take the cross without the Pope's permission. The movement spread rapidly, and soon an army of 60,000 men was formed by the Pastoraks, who carried a banner depicting the Blessed Virgin appearing to the Hungarian master. This army soon became the enemy of the clergy, who had induced the king to visit the Holy Land. With increasing audacity, the clergy were attacked and preached against the bishops and even the Pope. They entered Paris with predictions of doom. There, they split into several factions that spread terror throughout France. Blanche finally realizes that she has made a mistake and orders the royal officers to arrest and destroy them. A group of citizens followed and stopped them. The Hungarian master was murdered, along with a large number of his followers. Louis at Acre, 1250 to 1254. After arriving in Acre, Louis reviewed his plans for the future. His mother had urged his return to France in the face of public unrest and other pressing issues, but he felt he should stay. His disastrous crusade destroyed both the French and Outremer armies. It was his duty to stay with the last prisoner until he was released. On July 3rd, he publicly announced his decision to stay. A letter was sent to the nobles of France informing them of his decision and asking for reinforcements for the crusade. He was acutely aware of the failure of his great endeavor with the loss of thousands of lives. The real ruler of the kingdom, the king's brothers and the leading nobles of the crusade departed from Acre in mid-July, leaving an army of about 1,400 men in the Holy Land. The queen stayed with the king. Henry I of Cypress died on January 18, 1253, leaving his son Hugh II as heir to Cypress, only a few months old. His widow, Pleasance of Antioch, daughter of Bohemond V, claimed the kingdom of both Cyprus and Jerusalem. Plaisance then eventually married Arsuf's son Balin. But, in reality, it was Louis who continued to administer the government. Negotiations for prisoners. After Turanshah's death, Nasir Yusuf made a friendly capture of Damascus on July 9, 1250. The rivalry between Cairo and Damascus gave Louis a good chance, as both were eager to help the Franks. Shortly after arriving in Acre, Louis received an embassy from Nasir Yusuf, but remained neutral. Nasir Yusuf's Damascene army invaded Egypt and on February 2, 1251, faced the Egyptian army under Aibak near Zagazig. The Syrians were successful at first, but were soon defeated by the Mamluks. Yusuf fled back to Damascus. Mamluk power in Egypt was saved, but the Aubaids still occupied Palestine and Syria. When Joseph approached Acre about trading with Jerusalem in exchange for Frankish help, Louis sent an embassy under John of Valencia to Cairo, warning Aibak that he would ally with Damascus if the issue of Frankish prisoners was not resolved soon. His ploy led to the release of about 3,000 captives in exchange for 300 Muslim prisoners. Louis then demanded the release of all the remaining prisoners without paying the second installment of his ransom. Aibak, realizing that Louis's envoy was visiting Damascus, agreed in return for a military alliance against Yusuf. He promised the return of the pre-1187 kingdom as far east as Jordan. Louis accepted the offer, and in March 1252 all prisoners were released. The Templars refused to break ties with Damascus, and Louis was forced to publicly rebuke them and apologize. When Nasir Yusuf learned of this agreement, he deployed his forces in Gaza between the two allies. Louis moved his forces to Jaffa, but the Mamluks did not advance beyond Egypt. For a year, the Syrians and Franks were at a stalemate, neither wanting war. Meanwhile, Louis repaired the fortifications of Jaffa. As early as 1253, Yusuf asked Baghdad to mediate between him and the Mamluks. The Caliph wished to unite the Muslim world against the Mongols, and he asked Aibak to accept the terms of Damascus. Aibak was recognized as Sultan of Egypt and allowed to annex most of Palestine. Peace was signed in April 1253. Fidai and Mongols, with no support from the West for the ongoing crusade, and in search of foreign allies, Louis looked to two unlikely sources, the Fidais and the Mongols. The leader of the Fidayin in Syria was Riduddin Abul Mali. After the destruction of the Franks at Damietta, Rid al-Din boldly demanded compensation from Acre for his neutrality and, in particular, the release of his tribute to the Hospitallers. He was reprimanded and thereafter sent a humble embassy bearing gifts to the king and requesting a closer alliance. Louis, knowing the hostility of the Ismaili sect to the Sunni Muslims, encouraged them and negotiated a treaty of mutual defense. Louis's main diplomatic move was to secure the friendship of the Mongols, enemies of the loyalists of Hassan bin Sabah. As early as 1253, Louis learned that a Mongol prince, Sartak, who was Batu Khan's son, had adopted Christianity. He immediately sent a contingent, led by the Dominican William of Rubric, to urge Sartak to come to the aid of his fellow Christians in Syria. But it was not in the power of this junior Mongol prince to break such an alliance. Louis's homecoming. Louis and his family left Acre on April 24, 1254. His boat was nearly wrecked off the coast of Cypress. In July, these royal travelers landed at Hyères, in the territory of their brother Charles I. Thus ended the 7th Crusade, which achieved nothing but loss of life and treasure. After the war, the 7th Crusade involved Outremer in a terrible military disaster. His coming east was both unfortunate and necessary, but his departure threatened immediate harm. He left behind him as his representative Geoffrey of Sargans for the empire. Conrad of Jerusalem's death on May 21, 1254 resulted in his 2-year-old son Conradin becoming king of Jerusalem, albeit nominally. Louis arranged a multi-year truce with Damascus from February 21, 1254, as Nasir Yusuf was justifiably concerned about the Mongol threat and war with the Franks. He had no desire The Aubaids of Egypt were also trying to avoid war, so in 1255 a 10-year peace treaty was signed with the Franks. The end of the Ayyubid dynasty came mainly from the siege of Aleppo, from 18 to January 24, 1260, in which the Mongols completed their invasion of the Levant. Later that year, on September 3, 1260, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut, halting the Mongol advance.